Hello, I'm Elena van Stee, blog editor for Context Magazine, and this MLK Day, I'm very excited to welcome our special guest, Dr. Hajar Yazdiha. Hajar is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Southern California, and she's also the author of a recent book titled The Struggle for the People's King. Her book looks at how a wide range of social movements have used, and importantly, often misused, Dr. King's legacy for a very wide range of political ends. And she's here to tell us all about it. So Hajar, welcome to the Context blog.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, let's start with some background to your research. First of all, can you tell us a little bit about what prompted your initial interest in Dr. King's legacy?
Oh my gosh, yeah. So, I mean, even from the time I was a kid, I was really interested in Dr. King, the civil rights movement. I think part of it was just being the daughter of Iranian immigrants living in, predominantly white community. And I was really raised by parents who had been political activists. And so they really ingrained this kind of political consciousness in us. And so, really early on, when I started learning about the civil rights movement, it was like, this simplistic, but I think really genuine interest in how people come together to stand up against the bad guys. But it was really during grad school, and I was thinking about race and social movements and power and trying to think about what I was going to do for my dissertation. And at the same time, I was watching this real kind of right wing backlash play out in the news against Obama. I saw the rise of the Tea Party. And I was really fascinated by this rise of this language of white victimhood, this idea that under Obama, there was a lot of reverse racism against white people. And of course, in a lot of these political claims, the words of Dr. King were coming up. And that's really where the project started, was just this question of, how can his words be turned on their head in this way? And then why does it matter?
Very interesting. Can you give us a specific example, maybe of a way that you were really surprised or shocked to see Dr. King's words used?
Yeah, I mean, I think the one that really drew me to the project, it's the story I tell in the book, was the case of Abigail Fisher, which was playing out during this time. And if, listeners aren't aware or, don't remember, Abigail Fisher was a young white woman who was rejected from the University of Texas at Austin. And she kind of became the figurehead of taking affirmative action on and trying to repeal it, because the claim was that she was rejected because she was white. And, it was the same sort of story where in the political claims around that case, Dr. King's words kept getting invoked. And it was the idea that Dr. King would have opposed affirmative action because he wanted us to be judged by the content of our character and not the color of our skin, which of course is flipping his quote and also decontextualizing it. And that was really the case that drew me in.
Fascinating. Tell us more about what it is you're trying to do with the book. What's the main argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think at its basic level, the book is really about how the political misuses of the racial past, specifically in this book, the collective memory of Dr. King and of the civil rights movement, how they have consequences for democracy. And so I think it's really easy to look at the misuses of the past as kind of rhetorical flubs. A lot of times we'll laugh them away and we'll think, well, that's ridiculous. Of course, that's not what Dr. King meant. But I think what I really show in the book is that these are both intentional political strategies and they have these really dangerous consequences. And so when we're thinking about this question of social cohesion, we talk all the time about polarization. Why are we so divided? And I really root this in this question of collective memory, the fact that we're actually coming to the table understanding social reality in these really divergent ways.
Very cool. I'm curious about the data for your book, especially since this project has both a historical and a contemporary aspect. What were you looking at to make this argument?
Oh my gosh, Lena. So I collected so much data and it was unintentional. So I think for anybody who's done a dissertation with a kind of open-ended question like this, this question of like, how does Dr. King get co-opted and tracing it over time, it does not come with a kind of clear set of guidelines around, oh, this is the data you're going to use. And, these are the specific methods you're going to use to answer this question. It was an iterative process. And so it initially started with a kind of more formalized, systematic data collection process where I used this existing data set of social movement organizations that was developed by Neil Caron and Etta Menta. And from there, I took a sample and I was looking at, which one of these movements all across the spectrum have used the memory of the civil rights movement. And as it turned out, all of them had. And we're talking about everything from the animal rights movement to the gun rights movement, Muslim rights, abolitionist movements. So all of them had used this memory. And so once I realized that this was a really prolific strategy, that's when I started getting into the nitty-gritty of the questions of, okay, how does it take shape? What does it look like on the ground when movements are deploying memory? And then what are the consequences? And so that required a lot more data. And so I went from using just newspaper data to then supplementing with a ton of archival data from organizations. I relied so heavily on LexisNexis and the Wayback Machine, otherwise known as archive.org.
Yeah.
And they were incredible. And of course, you can only go back so far. The internet started, late 90s. And so we didn't have web pages from before. And so sometimes I had to really get into primary resources from organizations, also thinking about secondary resources, which looking at histories of certain social movement organizations was really valuable, because sometimes just in the footnotes alone, I would find these gems. And so I think the fact that it took me so many years just to put that data together for my dissertation, and then, of course, I graduate and Trump is elected.
Yeah.
And so then I'm like, oh, the story has not ended. So then I ended up collecting data from 2016 to 2020 as well. And just putting all of these pieces together was a lot of heavy lifting, but I think it paid off.
Yeah, very much so. One thing I would love to hear more about, what you found in the data and kind of the broader story of, is what you wrote about in the post about the creation of MLK Day as a holiday in the first place and how Reagan was involved with that. I think that's a backstory that we don't often hear. So tell us more.
Yeah, this was really fascinating to me because, as I mentioned, I initially thought this story was one that was rooted in the kind of reactionary politics after Obama's election.
Hmm.
And I didn't anticipate that my story and the kind of trajectory of the question I was trying to answer, that they would take me all the way back to not just the civil rights movement proper, but kind of this moment in the early 80s, which is when the debates over the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday kind of get into a fever pitch. And this is the point where Reagan is forced to contend with this 15-year battle to create a Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. And of course, these battles themselves are just so rich with insight into how folks were thinking about King at the time. I think at this point, most of us have heard that something that we probably didn't know in our childhood, which is that the year that he died, he was killed, 75% of Americans disapproved of Dr. King. And so he was not liked. He was kind of hated. And folks thought he was a rabble rouser. People called him a communist. At this point, news had gotten out, thanks to the FBI, about some of his adultery. And so there were questions about his moral credibility that were really brought to the fore when, politicians were trying to decide if he was worthy of a holiday. And his wife, Coretta Scott King, who was a civil rights activist in her own right, she was really at the forefront of a lot of these efforts. So, just 2 months after he was murdered, she had founded the King Center to carry on his legacy. And so she was really central to the preservation of the kind of true King. But at the same time, already what she called the right-wing circus was working to defile his memory. They called him divisive. They really threw every kind of playbook at the memory of Dr. King to make sure that he wasn't institutionalized. And so it says something that by the time we get to 1983, Reagan, who himself had opposed civil rights, he called, the 1964 Civil Rights Act a bad piece of legislation. He himself was really opposed to just civil rights in general. He felt like they infringed on individual rights to discriminate. And so the political pressure had reached this point where he really had to grapple with, okay, I need to actually approve this King holiday, but I'm going to do it on my own terms. And so he decides to sign the bill. And in turn, he decides he's going to institutionalize a very specific image of Dr. King. And this is one where he says that King is going to be a kind of symbol of American exceptionalism, of colorblindness, of the dream realized. And so he describes this as a moment where Dr. King has lifted the great burden of racism from the country, and we're all going to kind of rejoice and celebrate the accomplishment of Dr. King, but definitely treat it as if racism has ended. And now Dr. King can be used as the symbol of a free market, of being able to pull yourself up from your bootstraps, of the value of race neutrality, not talking about race because it no longer matters. And what we find is, through the 80s, right-wing groups continued to pick up and deploy this very memory, this co-optation that Reagan started. And so I think that is a really important story to tell, because it is so easy to think of these kind of misuses of Dr. King as a newer phenomenon. But once you realize that it really goes back, it's rooted in these initial debates over the King holiday, that's when you come to see, like, this is an intentional strategy. This has been going on for quite some time.
Fascinating. Not new then. Our current moment is maybe unique, but not unprecedented.
Yeah.
All right, then, lastly, what insights do you hope others will take away from your research?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think for me, there are the empirical insights that I hope will be taken away kind of more broadly. And those are, one, that this is, the misuses of the past are intentional political strategies, and we should treat them as such. I think when we hear the past being used in a way that doesn't sit right, that doesn't ring true with the history that we know, that should raise a red flag. That should be a moment to pause and kind of think more deeply about what the political project is. I think second, I want us to understand that the misuses of the past have these significant consequences for social cohesion, for our democracy, for our capacity to come together and solve social problems, move collectively into the future. But then I think beyond that, and this is really a kind of more theoretical and conceptual takeaway that I hope to leave social scientists with, is the idea that I hope we can take time more seriously. And so, not just time the way we typically think about it as a kind of finite, linear sort of measurement, where we think about longitudinal studies, for example, but time is a symbolic resource. And so, in the book, I'm building this critical theory of memory and contentious politics. And it's one that really thinks about time as a symbolic resource that's distributed unequally. It thinks about time as something that is a constant negotiation between the perceived past, the perceived present, the perceived future. And I think if we can take some of these questions and kind of incorporate them in other studies, I think it'll be more clear kind of how our understanding of the past actually shapes every realm of social life. And so I would argue it matters for everything from education to health, all the way up to politics, and then also at every level, right? So not just thinking about memory as something that's an individual process, but also something that's collective, that's political. And so I think these are really some of the larger takeaways that, for me, are critical to understanding the value of the book.
Well, this is fascinating research. Thank you for sharing it with us, Hajar.
Thank you so much for having me.
And take care. Bye.
Bye.